All right. How's everybody doing? Welcome to Real Crusades History. This is a special live stream tonight. I'm with my good buddy Rand. Rand, how you doing, sir?
Pretty good. It's been a very long time. So
Definitely. It's been a while since we've done something like this, but we want to start doing it more often. Okay, so yeah, the idea tonight is to talk a little bit about the Second Crusade. Now, my idea for this is that I want in October to do a either weekly or bi-weekly series, depending on everybody's schedule, where we actually cover the whole Second Crusade in podcast format. Kind of like what we did with our podcasts about the First Crusade, Third Crusade, and Fourth Crusade, which you guys will remember from several years back. Those were a lot of fun. We did kind of an episode for each of the big, events of those crusades, and we're going to kind of do the same thing with the Second Crusade. But today, this is going to be a very relaxed, very almost kind of like a brainstorming session. A lot of times before we would do these podcasts, we would start off just by getting the group together to talk about, some ideas. But hey, everything is content now, so we're going to actually let you guys be kind of in on that. So you guys in the chat can kind of help us sort of brainstorm the Second Crusade and kick around some ideas. We've got some beautiful artwork to look at to kind of get us into some of the events of the Second Crusade. And I've also got a handy timeline that we'll be looking at. Awesome. So yeah, I'm really glad to have Rand with me. Rand is always good to have on your team when you're looking at the Crusades. Rand knows a lot, and I think between the two of us and between you guys in the chat, we'll be able to come up with some interesting insights about the Second Crusade. So, what do you think, Rand?
well, I'm massive. I very much appreciate the vote of confidence. It not only has it been a while since I've done anything with Real Crusades history, just because of things going on, personally and professionally and all that kind of thing. I've moved 4 times in the last 6 months. It's been kind of a crazy a crazy past year for me. But no, it's also kind of been a while since I've done anything really with Crusade scholarship. I did read the last really good book on the topic I read was about a year ago. It was Stephen Tibble's book, Crusader Armies, which is very good. I would very highly recommend that to all of our audience. It's Stephen Tibble goes into a lot of very new scholarship, and he breaks a lot of new ground when it comes to how the Frankish armies in the Levant worked, who was in them, how they operated. It was really fascinating. But yeah, unfortunately, other than that, it's kind of been it. So I really appreciate being brought back on here. It's been way too long, and unfortunately, that's mostly been my fault. So, but no, it's really great to be back here.
Awesome. So yeah, I got a little. We got a couple of super chats here. I want to acknowledge those before too much time goes by. Thank you guys. These are two really good friends of the channel. You guys are awesome. We got Doyle here, who's a very good man. Thank you very much, Doyle, for the $15. And by the way, all super chats are going to go toward the Knights of the Cross TV show this evening, as always. And I'll get into a little plug on that in a minute here. But Doyle asks, why didn't Conrad accept Templar help, and why did Lewis wait so long? Yeah, I'm not sure. The Templars, this is a very early period in their history. So this is kind of the Second Crusade is kind of when they really first make a name for themselves in some respects, beyond just being popular with Bernard of Clairvaux and the church. They really, this is an important chapter in their history. So we'll touch on that. And then also we got a Nice super chat from Sam. Sam, of course, is a good buddy of ours. Thank you, Sam. He says he's looking forward to tonight. We appreciate that, Sam, and you will probably have some good insights to hopefully you will chime in, Sam, as we continue. And then we got one from our good buddy Chris Torres, he's hiding as Bahamut Zero, but we know who he is. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that, buddy. Cool. So one thing I wanted to say, just to start off, this I was kind of thinking about this as I was looking at this little timeline of the Second Crusade, which I'm going to go ahead and put that up. But the Second Crusade, we always think about the fact that at least in the East it was such a failure, and yet I do think it's kind of interesting to see how in the middle of the 12th century it's almost like a world war. I mean, the Latin West is launching almost what would by their standards be a global campaign. They're attacking the Moors in Portugal and in Spain also. They are going after the Wends in the east, in a region that I believe is now Poland, if I'm correct. It was like Saxon Crusaders going against what a pagan group that is in a part of the world that I believe is now Poland for the most part. But then also they were going after the Turks in the Holy Land. So you've got the King of France and the King of Germany leading armies into the Holy Land. Now, think about where the Latin West is at this point from, say, like in the age of Charlemagne, when this kind of, not only would a continental crusade be kind of unimaginable, but it's three-pronged at this point. So the Second Crusade, while the campaign in the East is just this big failure, that's kind of like one of the glaring failures in the history of the Crusades, the campaign itself, for the broader campaign, is kind of a sign of the fact that the Latin West is very much becoming one of the dominant players in the Mediterranean world in a way that was just unthinkable in the early Middle Ages. What do you think, Rand?
No, I think that's a very fair characterization of what was happening in that period. You're really, what you're seeing in the Second Crusade is you're witnessing the results of the enormous groundswell of popular enthusiasm that generated in the aftermath of the First Crusade in Europe. You're witnessing, this is really kind of the crusading kind of reaches. It's starting to reach fever pitch in Christendom, in the Latin West. And it's, it is now it's now a bona fide phenomenon, a bona fide cultural and social phenomenon in medieval Europe at this time. So that's why, you just see so much popular participation in the Second Crusade. And what's funny is, you mentioned that, there were all these movements on these other fronts. The funny thing about the Second Crusade is that almost none of that was on purpose. Like none of these other offensives that went off into heatheness or heathen territory. They really were just sort of grassroots. Or in the case of Lisbon, they just sort of happened. They're all the guys who set out from Dartmouth and were headed to and ended up in Lisbon. They were actually originally supposed to be in the Holy Land, and that was their original destination. They made a port of call in Portugal and were basically approached by the Portuguese king at the time. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was
Alfonso the Conqueror.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Alfonso the First.
Yeah, and they're literally just sort of approached by him, and they just go, "Hey, we could really use your help. I'm trying to take Lisbon back from the Moors, and oh, by the way, that your crusading vows apply here too. which was true. They did. So they ended up staying and essentially winning the city of Lisbon for the Reconquista, which was a major accomplishment for in the history of the Reconquista. It was in many ways you could say it was kind of a turning point for at least the coastal regions of the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, and but the kind of the funniest part about that whole thing is that that was not the original plan. It just almost kind of happened it just kind of almost came about by happy accident. So there's a lot of stories like that during that period of the Second Crusade, and then of course I know we'll get into the the situation of the actual part of the armies that went to the Levant and all that, and how the difficulties that they ran into there and whatnot. So, but I would say that the Second Crusade is really important because it highlights just how intensely the crusading phenomenon had taken roots in all across Western Europe at this time, and that there really was sort of a crusading fever that was in the air of Europe in the 1120s, because everybody these were all the sons of the guys who had gone off to the First Crusade.
Sons
and maybe grandsons,
probably more grandsons would be my guess.
Yeah. But these were the next generation of crusaders who wanted to go out there and prove themselves, who wanted to go, live up to the accomplishments of the First Crusade. That still figured very, very large in everybody's cultural consciousness at the time.
Yeah, I think definitely, by this point, the First Crusade was a legendary event. In fact, it was it was probably, like the touchstone event for the culture at the time. I mean, which again kind of speaks to your point about how crusading had so totally transformed the culture. When the First Crusade was getting going, there were a lot of people who were like, I'm not going to do this. None of the kings of Europe even went. But the success of the First Crusade so totally impacted Latin culture that, it was the event really of the century, and everybody, the songs were about it. The popular culture was looking back at it. So all across Latin Christendom, you had young men of the knightly class who grew up, and not just that, of ordinary classes as well, who grew up thinking about this and dreaming about this. And jumping back to what you were saying about in the Iberian Peninsula, and I think that the church wasn't initially thinking that this was going to be like a multi-pronged event, but of course what happened was the kings of Spain and Portugal, like Alfonso I of Portugal and Alfonso VII of Leon Castile, asked that the Crusade bull be extended to include their campaigns, and of course that was granted. And then meanwhile, a group of Saxon crusaders who wanted to invade this territory of the pagan winds to their east, they did something similar. They said, hey, can we have our crusade bull extended for this campaign? These are pagans, just like the Muslims, so surely you would, as they would have thought of it, so surely you would let us do that. And of course that was granted to them. And we mentioned Lisbon, but also Alfonso VII of Leon Castile, he took the city of Almeria, which was with the help of some French crusaders as well, which again was a major port in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. That was a huge event that made a big impact. Later, that would be retaken by the Moors and then wouldn't be taken again until Isabel and Fernando took it in the 15th century. But so getting back to the launching of the Second Crusade, I think of course we always hear about Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was the engine really behind the Second Crusade. He was such an important figure during the period in the middle of the 12th century. Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Bernard, a huge figure in Catholic history. I think there's no question he was probably the most influential person in Latin Christendom at that moment. And the fact that he so endorsed the Crusade was a huge thing. And this again showed how this had become the mainstream drive of the church. So a couple of things. I guess we can jump back to the fact that back in November and December of 1144, in the Crusader states, Zengi, one of the most powerful of the Turkish leaders in the Levant, conquered Edessa from the Crusader states. Then Zengi himself was murdered in September of 1146 in his bath by a Frankish slave, interestingly enough. So Zengi is killed. His sons will take over for him. They'll kind of fight each other a bit. But December 1st, 1145, Pope Eugenius III issues a bull called Quantum Predecessoris, which I believe that refers to as your ancestors did, so take up the cause that your ancestors, so succeeded at. And St. Bernard really and I think one of the things that St. Bernard really preached when he was preaching before the warrior classes of Latin Christendom, he said, God is going to do the same thing for you that he did for the first Crusaders. And I think this kind of gets us to maybe one of the issues with the Second Crusade is that the kings who led it, Louis VII and Conrad III of Germany, and Louis VII and his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, along with many of the French nobles, took the cross at Burgundy from Bernard of Clairvaux himself in March of 1146. And then just to jump back a little bit earlier, in the previous Christmas, Conrad had taken the cross also directly from Bernard himself. So Bernard was traveling around preaching the cross all over the place. So first to the Germans, then to the French. First the German king takes the cross, then the French king takes the cross. And I think there was this sense that I don't want to oversimplify it because I think strategy always plays a role, but I do think there was really a sense that, and Bernard was almost pushing this, go and God is going to hand you a victory. This is God's will. He's going to hand you this magnificent victory if you will just heed the call. And I think when we're looking at the leaders of the Second Crusade, King Louis VII and Conrad III, these guys were not great military commanders. And the Second Crusade proves that. The First Crusade really benefited from a couple of really capable military commanders. Of course, Bohemund of Taranto, the Norman, who was really a military genius, is one of them. But I don't know. What do you think of that, Rand, in terms of the military organization of this expedition?
No, I'd say you're touching on some things that they're very, very critical to understanding the Second Crusade and why it ended up the way it did. Namely, the fact that, as you very rightly said, that the two principal commanders, being Louis VII and Conrad the third, neither one of them had a reputation for military competency. They had Louis VII was kind of always he was he had grown up in a period. He was a very capable politician. He was a very capable statesman. But in terms of the military department, he was not very well known, and it showed with his future conflicts after the Second Crusade with people like the Plantagenets and Henry II and people like that. His wife's future husband, and same thing with Conrad III. They were not Godfreys, they were not Baldwins, they were not Bohemunds, they were not even Raymonds, or the First Crusade really did benefit from this constellation of very competent military commanders and very experienced military men. Most notably Bowman of Toronto, who is hands down, unquestionably the most competent military figure there, but or at least the most experienced. But but even the others were very were very militarily competent. William the Conqueror's eldest son, Robert of Normandy, was a very competent military commander, even though he had a very problematic personal life. So there was definitely a disparity between the types of men that led the First Crusade and the types of men that led the Second. And I think you do touch on a somewhat controversial aspect of the Second Crusade, in that, yes, what was the role of Bernard of Clairvaux's preaching of the Second Crusade in perhaps, enhancing these otherwise mediocre, leaders in a military sense into thinking that they were capable of doing something that in reality maybe they weren't. I think it's a question worth asking. I think it's a question worth investigating or looking into. Will we ever really know? Probably not. But I would agree with you that Bernard's preaching of the Second Crusade almost turns out to be a somewhat problematic affair. It was extremely beneficial in that Bernard of Clairvaux was already a very popular religious luminary even before the Second Crusade. You could almost call him, he was sort of the poster boy for the sort of Catholicism that had come about in the aftermath of the Cluniac reforms and the investiture crisis. It was this very aggressive, very belligerent, very very alive spirituality, and he embodied that. He's still known to this day in the Catholic Church as not only a canonized saint, but he's considered one of the founders of one of the great religious houses, namely the Cistercian order, that's still around today. He was basically the sponsor of the Knights Templar at the Council of Troyes, where they officially came into being. So even the Templar order in a lot of ways owed their official existence to him. He was a firebrand of a preacher. He was very involved in the political goings on of the day. Some even not only today, but even some back in his own time thought that he did so a little too much. He was a very, very energetic figure and charismatic figure who drew a lot of attention to the Second Crusade and helped make the Second Crusade what it was. What I don't think he did was I don't think he fully appreciated the sort of leadership that he was placing all those hopes and aspirations onto, and that I would make the argument that he maybe vastly overestimated the capabilities of Louis VII and Conrad III, and that played out. Not necessarily because they were, it wasn't all their fault why it happened the way it did. Some of it was just legitimately bad luck. But yeah, I think had a much more competent leadership been in place, the Second Crusade probably would have ended very differently.
Yeah, a couple of differences. Yeah, for one thing, the First Crusade was made up of a lot of guys who planned to stay in the Holy Land, like people who wanted to conquer stuff and rule it. A lot of times you'll hear this idea that, like, oh, well, that's this stain on the First Crusade. There's these guys like Bohemond and Tancred who were really wanting to, like, win empires for themselves. And Baldwin of Bologna is another person like that. But the reality is that was very helpful after the First Crusade. And, during the whole process, the fact that these guys were conquering stuff and intending to settle. Another thing, I do think Pope Urban II was a bit more of a practical type of planner than Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux was more just like, just surrender yourself to God and all that kind of. I really love Bernard of Clairvaux. I'm not trying to, say anything negative about him at all. But I do think, Urban II, I think was a little bit more in tune with some of the military realities of the period. He had more long-term interactions with some of the more experienced commanders, from that period of time. But anyway, just kind of jumping forward as we get further into, the events of the Second Crusade. One of the issues I think we see is the fact that, kind of like the First Crusade, the armies of the Germans and the French both end up in Constantinople, but they both march separately. The Germans depart first. The Germans arrive in Constantinople. Conrad arrives with his army in Constantinople in September of 1147. And Louis's army is going to, where Louis's army had departed back in June of 1147. And I believe by the time Louis even arrives in Constantinople, the Germans had already suffered their major defeat against the Seljuk Turks. October 25th, 1147, the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, the German army is almost completely wiped out by the Seljuk Turks. I think the fact that the two armies didn't travel together, like in the First Crusade, you've got all of the forces. This picture here, it's kind of funny. It shows, this is a image from a manuscript. It shows Louis and Conrad riding together, but of course their armies traveled separately and were both defeated separately in Asia Minor by the Turks. And also another feature that we know from the source material is that both armies marched with fairly lax discipline. And one of the things that happens in medieval armies when you don't have capable commanders is the individual contingents kind of start to try to look out for themselves, right? So individual counts and lords and stuff are kind of like, look, I'm going to just like make sure my guys are okay. So you don't have a really strong, tight marching order, which is needed when you're moving through hostile territory. We know that, for example, Louis VII's army, there was like a lot of space opening up between the different contingents as they were moving through Asia Minor. And of course, this is deadly when you're dealing with the Seljuk Turks because they ambush those contingents and they can cut them off. And the opposite of Richard the Lionheart, right, who kept his marching order extremely tight and the Turks couldn't disturb it. So,
and even contrary to the experience of the First Crusade, the First Crusade, after their Battle of Dorylaeum, which really was only won because of the military competence of Bohemond of Toronto and his Italian Normans, who really held the line until the rest of the army came and joined. And after that, you see a marked change in the First Crusade's progress across Anatolia, and that they do exactly what you're saying. They became a lot more tighter. The order of march became much more disciplined, and much more coalesced, so that they could, the various elements could easily support one another if they came under attack. And they basically marched across the rest of Anatolia almost unmolested. Whereas, the Second Crusade, there was just no cohesion whatsoever. There was no command and control. There was no hardly any discipline in the order of march. The two main contingents couldn't even coordinate with each other. Which is why you had them both trying to attempting to go across Anatolia on their own. So yeah, it was that right off the bat should have given everybody an idea of the competency of the sorts of leadership that they had in the Second Crusade, unfortunately.
Yeah, I want to. Storymaker's got a good question, but actually, before we go too much further, I do want to just talk about Knights of the Cross real quick here. So let's look at. We're going to go to christianchannel.com/Knights of the Cross for a second here. Want to remind you guys that we are fundraising for the TV series Knights of the Cross, which is going to be on christianchannel.com. Link is down below. If you guys could jump down there, christianchannel.com/Knights of the Cross. This is going to be an original historical drama TV series about the Crusades. I'm excited about it. We're doing well with donations and with everybody helping out. Jump over here and see how you can support. There's a lot of options to support the show. I encourage you guys to do that. So yeah, christianchannel.com/Knights of the Cross. Check that out and see what we're doing with that. So, and yeah, the link is down below. Yeah, and kind of looking at some of the stuff you're mentioning, Rand. So yeah, the German army is defeated at the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, and again, the way that happens is that the army is ambushed. This is in October of 1147. The Seljuk Turks do their regular tactic of harassment and trying to goad contingents into charging, and this works. The army isn't held together. There's different contingents doing their own thing, and this results in just, the Turks are able to pick off and annihilate the different contingents. And it's interesting, the German army is almost completely wiped out before they get to the Holy Land. And then the big moment for the French in Asia Minor is January 6, 1148. So a few months later, and again, note that the armies are marching so far apart from each other. I mean, it's just, and I do want to, not to keep going off on different tangents, but one thing I want to look at is the Byzantines and their role in kind of facilitating some of this chaos, because there is some talk among historians. I know Christopher Tyerman mentions this, that the Byzantines themselves kind of sabotaged these two contingents, but we'll get back to that. But anyway, so January 6, 1148, Louis VII's army is defeated by the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Mount Cadmus. And this is not as bad a defeat as the Germans suffer. And one of the reasons for that is the presence of the Knights Templar. And somebody brought that up earlier. The Templars are kind of the only people who have their act together during this whole thing, and they prevent kind of as bad a disaster as what happens to the Germans. So Louis's army isn't wiped out. It is badly mauled and suffers heavy casualties, but it does survive. And there's an image here. I want to jump to the famous artist who created some really great images of the Crusades in the 19th century. This is Louis VII at the Battle of Mount Cadmus. One of the chroniclers describes him climbing up a tree, and he's got his sword and his shield, and he's fending off attacks from Turks, and he kills a bunch of Turks. And again, it's kind of one of those really memorable touchstone moments from the history of the Crusades. It's from one of our primary source chroniclers. It's a cool image. And, exactly how that played out, or how, authentic that chronicler's description is. Nevertheless, it does, give us some insight into the desperation of the situation. The king himself is barely hanging on and trying to fend off attacks from the Turks. But yeah, any thoughts on on this phase of things, Rand, and kind of the role of the Templars with the French, how they're able to prevent as bad a disaster as what happens to the Germans?
Yeah, well, understand that at this time, the Templar, the composition of the Knights Templar were not entirely French, but were the vast majority of them were French knights. So they probably had a more cultural affinity for their fellow French, who were marching with Louis VII. Many of them probably even had friends and maybe even relations, in those armies and whatnot. So there probably was a much greater degree of connection there. So that shouldn't be too surprising for anybody who's looking into it. I think the other thing that really starts to come out is you start to see the development of the Knights Templars what would later become their famed reputation for their just phenomenal discipline on the battlefield, and that and they're especially at the tactical level, the tactical proficiency that they exhibited, really did come into play during the events of the Second Crusade. The other thing that's really striking about the Second Crusade, and especially when we're talking about the leadership and just how it played out militarily, was unlike many of the other Crusades, there was almost no real representation amongst the Crusader leadership of people who knew the territory. What you might call host nation support. Like, you did not have, like, even in the First Crusade, you had Byzantine advisors during the march up to Antioch, and then after Antioch, you had native Christians, Christian elements, most notably the Christian Armenians, who lent major support to the Frankish armies and the Frankish leadership. In the Third Crusade, you would also have a major role played by what would be at that time the native Frankish nobility, the military orders, both the Templars and the Hospitallers, who had been fighting there for generations and knew the lay of the land, knew the type of enemy that they were fighting. In the Second Crusade, you really don't see any of that, or at least not in a meaningful way with the Germans and the French as they made their way to the Holy Land. They both kind of pissed off the Byzantines in their own ways. Yes, there's absolutely a conversation to be had of maybe was there a Byzantine policy in place to sort of hinder and hamper the crusade? I wouldn't be surprised if there was, and I think there is enough evidence to suggest that there was something like that afoot. But at the same time, the Crusaders themselves did quite a bit to definitely not endear themselves to the Byzantines. So you didn't have that element at play. And then when they got into the Holy Land, they kind of devolved into this political situation or this political attitude where they kind of just wrote off the Frankish, the native Frankish leadership that was there at the time, both in the Principality of Antioch and in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They really did not. They didn't even really endear themselves with their own fellow Franks who had been present in the Holy Land, at that point for about almost 50 years. By that point, and it is kind of baffling to see the sorts of attitudes that crop up. And I know I'm going a little bit further down the timeline, than where we're at. But especially once both Conrad and Philip get into, or and Louis get into the Levant, it's almost kind of like they went in there making more enemies than friends. And even the king of Jerusalem at the time, I think it was Baldwin the third. Was it the second or the third?
Baldwin the third. He was still pretty young, though.
Yeah, they even kind of, they both sort of treat him like, oh, okay, well, we're here now, so you sit over there and do your thing. This is they really did kind of like sideline him, and and then of course there's the now famous disagreement that cropped up between Louis and his uncle-in-law, I guess, of Raymond of Antioch, Prince Raymond of Antioch, who was his wife's uncle, and there's that famous dust up, between the two. So yeah, they're what's very, very noticeable about the Second Crusade is they had almost no rapport with the host nation support that they could have had. Maybe they would have never had it with the Byzantines. I don't know. I don't think we know enough to be able to say for sure whether or not they would have had Byzantine support if maybe they'd been more diplomatic. I don't know. But definitely, especially once they get into Levant and they're interacting with the native Frankish leadership, it's just there just seems to be no effort whatsoever to cultivate any kind of a meaningful cooperation with the people that were there on the ground, in that region.
So, Storymaker, thanks for the super chat. He's got a good question here. What do you think made Frederick Barbarossa's march across Anatolia much more successful? So what he's talking about, of course, is that during the Third Crusade, there was a German contingent led by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, which successfully moved across Anatolia and defeated the Seljuk Turks in numerous battles, and in fact took over their capital city of Iconium. So very different than the outcome of the Second Crusade. Interestingly, Barbarossa was a young man present in the German army during the Second Crusade, so he experienced it. So it must have made an impression on him. Just to answer your question, Storymaker, I think really it's just a difference of discipline mainly. Barbarossa's army was very well led. Barbarossa himself was a very competent commander who maintained strict discipline. His son, who I believe his name was also Frederick, the Duke of Swabia, he was also a very capable commander, and they maintained really good discipline as opposed to Conrad III, who ran a lax ship, if you will. That's what I would answer on that one.
No, you're very, very correct, and it's interesting. A lot of people don't realize when they read about the Second Crusade, very few people realize that Frederick Barbarossa, who had played such a major role in the Third Crusade, was there as a young man, serving under his uncle Conrad III at the time. So yeah, I would agree very much with you that his experience during the Second Crusade left a major it impacted him for the rest of his life. And I think he got to learn the hard way by seeing firsthand what happens when, an army is in hostile territory, that is disorganized and poorly led and, no cohesion to speak of. So yeah, I think that's, you really hit the nail on the head with that. And then you see that be put into action, not just in Frederick's actions during the Third Crusade, which were kind of near the end of his life, but Frederick went on after the Crusade to become one of the more powerful, dynamic Holy Roman emperors that there were. You know, he was a very competent military commander in his own right. You know, even back in Europe. So, you know, I would very much agree with that assessment that, you know, his experiences in the Second Crusade and what he witnessed personally set him up for who he would become in the future.
And thanks for this one, Doyle. He asks, any idea how large the armies were under Louis and Conrad? I'd have to double check. I'm going to guess around 15,000 each, maybe a little bit smaller. I believe Frederick Barbarossa, his army was 15,000. So I would guess Conrad's was maybe around that size, maybe a little bit smaller. But I'd have to double check that. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. I don't know.
Of course, that's the very fraught topic of you know, numbers in the medieval period. You know, it's almost impossible to, with any degree of certainty, to, you know, give a specific number for, you know, for armies of this time period. But yeah, so it's, you know, I think the accepted numbers of anywhere between 10 to 20,000, you know, somewhere in that ballpark are probably pretty realistic. I would argue probably more on the lower end of that. Just, you know, just knowing the, you know, the limitations of logistics at that time, and the difficulties of even just raising armies of any substantial size at that period. Yeah, it was probably closer to 10,000 than it was 20, but that would be my guess.
Yeah. So, I do want to get some more questions from the chat. So we're kind of getting to that point, guys, where if you want to get some more questions in, then let us know. The Byzantine issue, I do think is interesting, though, because Manuel Comnenus, who was the Byzantine emperor at the time, he was married to a Latin woman. In many ways, he had kind of a pro-Latin attitude. He was the overlord of the Crusader states. That's another thing that we forget sometimes, is how closely the Crusader states and the Byzantine Empire really were existing at this point. A lot of people look back to the stuff that happened in the First Crusade. You know, really, at this point, you know, Manuel Comnenus is the preeminent Christian ruler in the East. The Crusader states are very, you know, cognizant of that. Look to him as an overlord, and this will become even more important a little bit later during the reign of King Amalric. But despite this, I do think we have to look at the fact that for the Byzantines, there was always a sense of not wanting a crusade to be too successful. And I think that, you know, the fact that the French and the Germans both had some suspicions about, you know, the guides that Manuel gave to them. There's some suspicion that the Byzantine guides actually led the German forces into, you know, some of these bad situations with the Turks, like led them into ambushes. That's kind of the extreme, you know, end of the speculation. But I think that, you know, yeah, it's just that's the reality, that is always going to be a component of Byzantine policy. And I think that you know, it's kind of weird when you think about it, but the reality is the Byzantine emperor is playing the Muslim powers in the Levant off of the Crusaders to an extent. He doesn't want either of them to be too successful. And that is a little strange to think about, but I think that's the reality. The outcome of the Second Crusade, I don't think, was a disappointment for Manuel Comnenus. I think that's the reality in terms of his policy. But I don't know if you have any more comments about that, Rand.
No, I think that's a fair assessment, and you very much you very much hit on it with the characterization that the Byzantines really didn't, or at least the Byzantine establishment did not want to see Crusades be too successful. That was a very accurate way of putting that. They still looked at all these lands as lost lands of their empire, and ultimately lands that they wished to recover or at least maintain some sort of suzerainty over. And with as Western friendly as Manuel Comnenus portrayed himself, and as he, and as he, led on, I think that really the idea of allowing the Frankish Crusaders to just sort of, run amok and cement their control over all these lands in the Levant and in northern Syria, and potentially even beyond, was a bridge too far for the Byzantine establishment. I don't think that is something that they would have allowed to happen. So I think it is very fair to question, just what role did they play in the outcome of this crusade. I think it's also very interesting to note that it is really after the Second Crusade that one begins to see the development of the severe mistrust between Frankish Crusaders from the West and the Byzantine Empire. That it's really after the Second Crusade that you start to see the suspicions arise amongst Westerners of, just exactly whose side is Constantinople actually on, because they don't really seem to be on our side. So, and we'll see that continued, we'll see that mistrust slowly but steadily grow, and build up to, unfortunately, its tragic climax in things like 1204 and the Fourth Crusade. I think the seeds that were laid during the Second Crusade between the Byzantines and the Latin West, I think, is really where eventually we'll end up at the Crusader the Frankish seizure of Constantinople, because none of them were Crusaders. They'd all been excommunicated by that point. But the Frankish seizure of Constantinople in 1204, and things like that. So this is really where it starts, is in the Second Crusade on a mass scale.
Yeah, and so we'll kind of start to wrap things up a little bit here. So, of course, what happens after all this terrible stuff happens in Anatolia? And I would like to point out that Louis VII, after that major disaster at Mount Cadmus, he actually leaves his army, which, again, is something that's just an unforgivable sin for a commander. He says to himself, okay, things are so bad. He puts the Templars in charge of everything, but then he says, okay, things are so bad, I'm just going to get on a boat and sail to Antioch, and these guys can just, finish slogging their way into Syria on their own. Again, an unforgivable sin for a commander. I think it's really kind of the most shameful moment for a commander in any of the major crusades. Louis IX, his crusades failed too, but at least he was, he hung with his troops to the bitter end. But Louis VII doesn't do that. He gets on a boat and he leaves his guys behind. And this is, of course, devastating for morale. There's more trouble with the Turks as those left behind. The main force has to continue on into Syria without their king. Louis arrives in Antioch, which, as you mentioned earlier, is ruled by his wife's uncle, who is a nobleman from the south of France, from the region that Eleanor of Aquitaine comes from, Raymond. There's a lot of talk. There's kind of this classic rumor that Louis didn't like Raymond because Eleanor and Raymond had something going on or something. A lot of historians have since dismissed that as that's kind of like rumor and
toxic courtly gossip.
Yeah, I don't think
is how I've seen it characterized by more recent serious scholars.
Yeah, and I don't think that really even explains the idea that like Raymond was urging Louis to go after Aleppo or Edessa or something, and Louis didn't want to do that because he was mad at Raymond. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think Louis had any intention of campaigning there. He wanted to get to Jerusalem, and he wanted to campaign, for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a strategic decision, not some kind of like a personal hang up or something. And Christopher Tyerman discusses this at length in God's War, and I think his analysis is spot on. Of course, Conrad.
I think it's also important to note that a lot of that really didn't come about until after Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII had already separated, and their marriage was annulled, and she ran off to later marry the husband she'd become most famous for being married to, which was Henry II Plantagenet of England. But yeah, so there was a lot of the rumors that circulated around were definitely most likely politically motivated. And medievals were sort of notorious for that. They'd kind of make up all these, very lurid stories of, the misdeeds of people who became, politically, politically unpopular or politically disfavored. You see that in English medieval history quite a lot. With problematic royal favorites and things like that. And there's all these, lurid rumors of, sodomy and, all this kind of stuff that most likely probably didn't actually happen. So it definitely, when you see things like that, when you're reading, medieval primary source materials and things like that, it's always important to take it with that historiographical grain of salt, to ask yourself, okay, who's writing this? What allegiances did they have? When was this written? All that kind of thing. So yeah, I would very much agree that with the current consensus, the current scholarly consensus about Eleanor of Aquitaine and her uncle Raymond of Antioch, that was really just that was politically motivated, toxic courtly gossip that came about later. I think there was more. I think what you did see between Louis VII and the native Frankish leadership was just a lot of political friction, and maybe kind of a okay, who outranks who here. I think Louis VII sort of came into the Holy Land thinking he was going to call all the shots because he's the King of France. He's the except for the Holy Roman Emperor, and even that is up for debate. The King of France is the premier. The kings of France always considered themselves the premier monarchs of Europe, of Christendom, and I think there was kind of an attitude. I think he brought that attitude with him into the Levant, and I think that's why he did so poorly with the native Frankish leadership, who, in many ways, I think they considered themselves his peer, and came to find that they were not going to be treated as his peer. So A lot of clash of personalities, I think, is what was really at play here.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I've always got the impression that Louis and Baldwin III and some of the upper ranks of the Kingdom of Jerusalem got along pretty well. I'm not sure Louis was that high-handed of a king. I mean, he's kind of like a monkish kind of more one of the less assertive kings of France. Like kind of how I've always perceived him. But it's an interesting question. It's an interesting thing to kind of look at. There's this image I've got up here. This is the Council of Acre. This is Conrad and Louis meeting with Baldwin III, who, again, Baldwin wasn't really that assertive as a king at this point. He was a teenager. His mother was actually the bigger power in the kingdom at the time. And when they did meet at this council to decide what to do, there were differing opinions about what to do. There were some crusaders who wanted to go after Aleppo. There were some who wanted to go after Damascus. This is again one of the big issues with the Second Crusade is, okay, well, this decision to attack Damascus was just a horrible decision. They should have gone after the Zengids. A lot of historians have again revised that and pointed out that Damascus was actually probably one of the weaker targets, that attacking Zengid Aleppo. The Zengids were very strong in northern Syria. Damascus was a bit isolated, and the Muslim dynasty there was somewhat insecure. The idea was to make a quick attack on Damascus and overwhelm it with a quick assault and seize the city, and that could have played out. I mean, I think there was some understanding that Damascus wasn't that well defended, and also there was fear that, and Doyle points out that Damascus was an ally at the time, and this is true. Damascus, I believe it was the Burid dynasty, was making alliances with the Kingdom of Jerusalem against the Zengids. But the reality is, even after this whole thing went down with the failed conquest of Damascus, that alliance held. The Burids continued to make alliance. I mean, so it's like they're,
the idea that the Crusaders made this massive blunder in attacking an ally in Damascus actually has been a little overstated. It was not as concrete as maybe modern readers would be tempted to think. Also, trying to seize Damascus actually was one of the more strategically sound ideas of the Second Crusade, because Damascus was in such a critical strategic position where it was at, and the sorts of land that it commanded. Had the Frankish forces taken Damascus, I think the story of the Crusader kingdoms would have played out very differently. Had they been able to secure that corridor. So, yeah, and again, this is where you run into the problem with the Second Crusade and its leadership of it was just so disjointed and it was so uncohesive that even when they did try to do something that was on the surface strategically sound, it's almost like they went about it in like the worst way possible. It just the entire operation ended up falling on its face. But yeah, I don't think the idea that Damascus, that the Burids were an ally at the time. They were also allies with a lot of people who were at war with the Crusader state. So sure, they were maybe an ally on the surface, but it was definitely not as clear cut as maybe some would be tempted to think today.
Well, and also they were perfectly willing to renew that alliance after this failed siege. I mean,
exactly.
The Burids, their main fear was the Zengids. They didn't want the Zengids to take over their city, which it seemed, I think everybody thought inevitably the Zengids are going to take Damascus, and the Crusaders wanted to head that off. Maybe it would have made more sense for the Crusaders to try to build the Burids up more or something like that. But again, these alliances between Muslim powers, the Crusaders could make them, out of convenience, but they were tough to really navigate, because again, that crucial religious divide. No, oops, I accidentally muted myself. That crucial, religious divide was the ultimate loyalty at the end of the day, and so anyway, and just talking about the attempt on Damascus. I mean, history's funny, especially medieval history. As we look back at it, it's easy to kind of sort of the benefit of hindsight type thing.
Yeah, Monday night quarterback.
Right. It was kind of an audacious move. It was a bit of a long shot, but it could have worked. I mean, the idea was to do a quick attack on the city and overwhelm it quickly. Maybe even create some chaos within the city. Nobody thought they were going to be able to hang out there and do a lengthy siege. So it didn't work. The whole thing was within 4 days or so. They come in, they make the assaults. They hear that, I believe it's Nur ad-Din is on his way to relieve the city, and so they withdraw. So it's kind of a big flop.
And even their positioning was very. Even the way they positioned, even the way the various elements of the army positioned themselves around the city was very tactically unsound. They set themselves up in areas that were very hard to supply. Some of them were in areas where the Damascenes had sort of scorched earth the area and things like that. So and this is where I sort of get my sense that Louis and Baldwin were not on the same page with each other, because I can't remember which source, I can't remember which account it is, but it's kind of recorded where Baldwin suggested a way to take the city, and when you look at it, when you look at what he was proposing, it was actually a lot more tactically sound than what ended up happening. And instead, Louis kind of goes and sets himself up in his army in his own way, in his own place, and kind of is on his own program. And that's just where there is kind of this iciness to the way Baldwin and Louis kind of interact with each other, especially at Damascus. And then after Damascus, it's almost like they don't even talk to each other afterwards. So there was something going on there. There was some kind of dynamic happening there that between the two kings, two men who should have been peers, that ended up, I think, making Damascus much more of a failure than it could have been.
Yeah, that's something we'll have to get into in more detail when we do our series, is look at the dynamic between the King of Jerusalem and Louis and Conrad, especially between Louis and Baldwin. Conrad was, I'm not sure if this is totally fair, but he was a bit of a non-player at this point, just because his forces were so I mean, he was still a very prestigious and important, opponent.
He was kind of he was just kind of along for the ride at that point,
right? Because of his resources had been so reduced. I mean, he had the prestige, but his army was almost probably relevant.
Probably numbered in the mere hundreds at that point.
But yeah, where was I going with that? But okay, yeah, that is something we'll want to look at, because I think that is really interesting. My understanding has always been that Baldwin was, again, he was very young. He was kind of inexperienced at this point. He was that alone made him overshadowed by even some of the high-ranking nobility, some of the more experienced commanders among the knightly classes of Jerusalem. And then, of course, Melisande herself was a huge presence during this. I mean, she was the preeminent figure during this period. But yeah, we'll have to look at that. But yeah, I think the Siege of Damascus. I think I don't think it was the totally moronic thing that some people make it out to be. I think it was a lot more of a potential success than what Louis IX was trying to do in Egypt. But
it was a great idea. It was horribly executed.
Yeah, I think that might be arguable, that it was poorly executed, or that it was maybe the wrong time. There were some people who at the Council of Acre argued for attacking Ascalon, which of course Baldwin III would go on to capture a few years later. And if that had happened, it's maybe there's a chance that that would have succeeded, and the Second Crusade would be this weird thing where these horrible defeats happen in Anatolia, and then there's this city taken in Egypt, which of course, just a few years later, that it is captured by the Crusaders. But anyway, yeah. Do we want to? Oh, it looks like Scott is trying to get in. Let's add him in here.
Are you gonna get on there?
Hey, Scott.
Hey, Stephen.
Yeah, we're just wrapping up the stream here. We're just.
I know it. I didn't get the notice until just a little while ago, but that's okay. I just wanted to say hi. Hello,
Scott.
everybody, our members out there.
Yeah, we were going to go over kind of just some final thoughts, I think, about the Second Crusade. We talked about, we just went over Damascus and all that. I don't know. Yeah, it's the Second Crusade. I think one thing that happens with the Second Crusade is it's kind of a hard lesson for the Latin West in what crusading really is going to be about. Again, Bernard kind of emphasized the spiritual aspect of it, which I think is important. But it's kind of interesting that the Third Crusade is so much more about strategy, and strategy is so much more emphasized. Like, what is the thing that makes sense to do? Of course, the whole fact that Egypt becomes the emphasis, as opposed to just let's go there and God is going to work a miracle for us. And I think, again, when the Crusaders all get back to when Bernard hears about what's happened, I do respect Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. I think he's a magnificent figure, but he says, "Look, this is because of our sins," and I think that is again, we're dealing with the medieval world, so that's going to come into play. That's always going to be an element of it, but it's just not true that that's why the Second Crusade failed. It's because of mistakes made by the commanders, poor strategy, and then again, like I kind of think like the biggest mistakes were made in Asia Minor, and then that brought everything to a weak point once they were actually in the Holy Land. I think that the decision to attack Damascus was actually one of the smarter things that people came up with during the Second Crusade, and again, because the forces were so badly damaged by then, that wasn't feasible. I mean, if Louis and Conrad had both arrived with intact armies, then conquering Damascus would have been much more feasible. I think but anyway, I'll let you guys kind of give some final thoughts, and we'll kind of close out here. We got a nice super chat from Sam. He says he's been enjoying this while working on his Hauberk and drinking cider. Awesome. That sounds like a thing to be doing, Sam.
It does. Yeah. No, I think you're very correct. I think the overall experience of the Second Crusade in the Levant and can be summed up with the phrase, it was great initiative, very poor judgment. It was very enthusiastically embarked upon. It really highlighted just how much crusading zeal was in Christendom at that time, but just the manner in which it was executed was just frankly awful. I mean, there's really no getting around it. Where the Second Crusade actually was successful is kind of like we talked about before we jumped on the stream, was it was kind of in all the places where it wasn't originally intended. It was in Lisbon, it was in Iberia, it was in Prussia, and the Wendish territory,
not yet Prussia,
and places like that. That's really where the Second Crusade actually had its most glittering success stories, was in these other places. So, yeah, I guess you could say that there were veterans of the Second Crusade who definitely learned very valuable lessons and applied them later on very successfully. Frederick Barbarossa being one of the preeminent ones. I think it's also telling that Eleanor d'Aquitaine accompanied her husband Louis VII on the Second Crusade, probably was witness to a lot of what happened there. And, she ends up becoming the mother of possibly one of the most brilliant, if at least in a military perspective, one of the most brilliant crusaders, Richard I, her son. And I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that, maybe a lot of what Richard applied during his time in the Levant during the Third Crusade maybe came from stories from his mother, who had witnessed the Second Crusade, who had witnessed the veritable disaster of the Second Crusade, and maybe passed some of those warnings or words of wisdom to her sons,
or probably from some other old timers too, who.
Yeah.
What I think that you can imagine, like somebody like Richard I, he probably is thinking, well, of course, a Capetian king has a spectacular failure in the Holy Land, right? It probably made perfect sense to him why Louis VII would have failed.
Well, I mean, he got to deal with Louis VII's son, Philip II, Augustus. He got to deal with him during his crusade. So. The Capetians did not. Overall, the Capetians did not have a very good showing when it came to crusading. That maybe just wasn't one of their strong suits.
Yeah,
I've got a question for you, Rand.
Go ahead, Scott. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Just from military, I mean, I know I'm backing up a little bit here. I got here late, but from just a military point of view, what do you think about the decision of the Crusaders to change positions at Damascus?
That's a good question. That's a really good question.
Yeah,
do you think they could have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat if? Do you think it would have been possible? I mean, I'm just thinking about your military point of view on that.
No, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the things about Damascus that I think was so disappointing was the decision to try and strike out for Damascus was a very sound one.
It wasn't.
It was. No, it was a very strategically sound decision or course of action, and it just unfortunately, because of a lack of cohesion between the leadership, it was horribly executed.
So you think that there was the change of position from a kind of an area where there was a lot of growing stuff and water and everything, and then they moved over to the other side.
Yeah,
where
and again, I think that just shows the lack of command and control that existed with the leadership that was on the ground at that time.
So it was you think it was bad leadership in that
for the most part, yes.
Okay.
I think
But do you think they could have possibly, won
Oh,
or
absolutely. Oh,
won
absolutely. No,
or,
I
or
think
been
I
successful
think
in the siege?
there's a lot of evidence that had they executed it differently, there's a lot of what I've read has suggested that if they had executed it according to the plan come up with that was proposed by Baldwin III, there's a very real chance that they could have successfully taken Damascus. And had the Frankish kings taken Damascus, because Damascus was in such a strategic corridor, that it's possible that the history of the Frankish presence in the Levant could have turned out very differently.
That's what I mean. It's just such a big deal, and it seems like they just let this potential victory just slip away through dumb leadership.
Yeah.
Hey, this is an interesting quote. I don't like to use Wikipedia, but this is sourced from an article. The general view now appears to be that the decision to attack Damascus was somewhat inevitable. Historians such as Martin Hott regard the decision as the logical outcome of Damascene foreign policy shifting into alignment with the Zengid dynasty. King Baldwin III had previously launched a campaign with the sole objective of capturing the city. This damaged the Burid dynasty's relations with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So I guess kind of what he's pointing out there, or what that is pointing out there in part, is that this idea that there was of like, oh, well, there was an alliance between Damascus and Jerusalem. Well, that's a lot more, questionable. And I know I've read that before too, that there were elements within Damascus that were very much trying to get the Zengids on board. Like the Zengids had agents inside of Damascus, and some of the ruling elites were wanting to go in that direction anyway. So, yeah, I think we really mislead ourselves if we just approach the whole thing as saying, well, wow, the decision to attack Damascus itself, that's just nuts. I mean, what a bunch of morons. I mean, anytime you're looking at a period of history and you're just outright dismissing a military decision as total stupidity, like what were these people thinking? They must have. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I think there are clearly examples of that in history, but we have to be careful about that, because it could be that what we're doing is there are things that those commanders at the time knew that we just don't have access to now. And so we have to study more deeply and kind of try to understand the situation in a more nuanced way. Anyway.
And going back to Bernard of Clairvaux, I know that, attributing the failure of the Second Crusade to, sin. Okay, that was the rationale or the logic of the time. But do you think he was kind of covering his, too? I think there was a aspect of that.
I think he probably genuinely believed that was the case. I mean, that's just how he was. Bernard of Clairvaux was, everything was about God,
Right.
acting in the world and surrendering to God. But I do think, I think comparing Bernard of Clairvaux to somebody like Urban II, I think Urban II was just so much more of a practical type of individual. He was more in tune with the realities on the ground. And I've always got the impression that Bernard of Clairvaux it's like the strategic situation in the Holy Land didn't even matter to him. He
was just totally in a different, where he literally believed that. And so you don't think there was if there was a covering his tracks or anything.
Well, maybe in a sense.
He was such a huge proponent, of the Second Crusade, and then it's just a complete failure. And
and I think like it's absolutely incorrect. I mean, the idea that like, well, what happened here is this was sin. I mean, no. I mean, that's not what happened.
Right.
What happened
I understand that.
Right. Yeah. And I know you do, but I think I find that so striking. Yeah, you read his comments about it, and it's so it's this idea that like, well, look, this is just like our sins, and you're so struck with the fact that that's so obviously incorrect.
Right.
again, some of that is disconnect between our time and this period of time. No matter what, medieval people were going to, you read Muslim writing from the time, they thought the same thing. When they failed, it was because of sin. But it's clear too, that that's not the only thing that went into the thinking of medieval people. I mean, you look at somebody like Richard I, he clearly thought that strategic decisions he made mattered. It wasn't just a matter of, well, we just trust God. And I think that in general, everybody thought that to some extent, especially, the nobility. I mean, these were practical warlike men. They did understand on some level that you had to make the right decisions for things to come out right. I mean, that's why they withdrew from Damascus. I mean, the plan was to get control of Damascus quickly. Right. And when they realized that a Zengid army was on the way to relieve Damascus, they said, this is an untenable situation. We're getting out of here. They didn't say, well, let's just pray, and God will give us this victory. No, they didn't. But yeah, it is really striking. I mean, Bernard of Clairvaux, his explanation for what happened is obviously incorrect. And one wonders how the majority of the nobility treated that. Did they think, well, he's a priest, of course he's going to say that. How many of them took it to heart? Was there a mixture of taking it to heart and also understanding that this is just kind of the way priests talk? It's hard for us to really understand exactly how people perceived this kind of thing during that period.
Oh yeah, I hear you on that.
It's fascinating though.
Hey,
yeah,
Jensen,
I just always wondered, Bernard was covering his rear end a little bit along with, because, it had to be unless he was existing in a separate universe, mentally or perceptively. I mean, he was, it had to be a huge shock and kind of humiliating after he'd been such a huge proponent and for it to just be a total failure.
Mm-hmm. But of course, it wasn't a failure everywhere. I mean, there were people who took the cross who succeeded. I mean, the kings of Spain certainly.
Oh, well, yeah. I'm thinking about the Holy Land expedition.
Well, right, yeah, of course. But the Second Crusade wasn't just in the Holy Land.
Oh, no.
And so one wonders, what did people think of that? Did they think, okay, well, I mean, is there really any reason to think that, the King of Portugal and the King of Land Castile were less sinful than Louis VII of France?
Right.
Anyway, yeah. Final thoughts, you guys. I'm kind of wondering what the chat thinks. I mean, we got a lot of smart people in the chat. Does anybody have any final thoughts on the Second Crusade? Like what you guys think some of the big issues were, like what was really missing, from the leadership and from decisions made by the leadership, but also, Scott and Rand, I want to hear from you guys too, like some of your final thoughts as well. But while you guys are talking, I'm going to be looking.
Well, actually, I am. Unfortunately, I've got something I need to run out for, but
we're done anyway.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for Stephen. Thanks for having me back on. I know it, like I said, it's been a while, but hopefully we'll be doing this more frequently. So thanks to all our viewers and listeners, and continue to stay tuned for what comes next. So hopefully we'll be getting you more stuff on this very soon.
All right. See you later, Rand. And yeah, like Rand is saying, the plan is for October. We're going to do a series about the Second Crusade, kind of like our First and Third Crusade series, where we look at each of the big events and kind of analyze them and talk about them. And so, yeah. Here's a nice little thing from Kitty here saying, this has been absolutely fascinating to listen to. Thanks for this stream. Well, thank you, Kitty. Appreciate that. And also from Rob, great stream, lots of great info. We appreciate that. All right, cool. Scott, do you have any final thoughts about the?
Well, I want to apologize for getting on so late. Number one.
No, that's fine.
But that anyway. At least I got here. But no, I just want to wish everybody the best and thank them for coming on. And yeah, the Second Crusade is really, because I've kind of jumped from the first to the third, in my investigations and stuff, and it's not an area that know a whole lot about, the second. So, I kind of sorry I missed the broadcast, and I'm looking forward to the series.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fun. I mean, I've wanted to get more.
Well, I'd like to be on, included, but
you'll be there.
It was much of a learn. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience that know more about the Second Crusade than I do. So it'll be nice for me to be on. Just I'll learn as much as more than I'll be able to contribute. But I appreciate your having me on, Stephen.
Absolutely. I wonder if we can get Dorothy to come on as a guest. She knows a lot of stuff about all this. So
Gina, who did you say?
Dorothy. Her name
Dorothy. Oh yeah. She'd love to come on.
Yeah, we should get her on here. Yeah, we'll have to find a few good guests to.
Dee is fantastic. But thing is, she's an expert on King Baldwin IV.
Yeah.
And that would be, I know she would be up for it because she knows the whole period. She taught history and everything and knows, her. I mean, she's kind of like a walking encyclopedia about some areas, but
she is.
She'd be great to have on.
Yeah.
And well, okay, I guess we'll contribute well.
I guess we'll go ahead and Ragplay says the second is like the opening act at a concert. But yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and close out for tonight. I told my wife I'd be streaming until for an hour, and now it's an hour and a half. So she's probably down there with the kids, like thinking, get down here. So, I'll help her out with the kids, and Scott, you can get back to whatever you're doing. But yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I always enjoy talking to everybody, and this is a really good topic. So yeah, everybody, look forward to our series about the Second Crusade coming in October, and I hope everybody in the chat enjoyed the conversation. It's been fun as usual. So yeah, we'll talk to everybody soon. Good night.
Good night.